Welcome back to the Electronic Intifada Podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abonima. As we enter the 9th month of Israel's genocide in Gaza with no end in sight, we wanted to take a look at Israel's insistence of maintaining a war of attrition while its own economy is in shambles, as more and more Israelis leave abroad for good, and as its high-tech sector collapses. We're joined today by Shir Hever. Shir is a political economist and is the military embargo coordinator for the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions National Committee, the BNC. He is the author of The Privatization of Israeli Security and the Political Economy of Israel's Occupation, and comes to us today from Germany. Shir, welcome back to the Electronic Intifada Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here again.
Good to see
Hi,
you.
Shir. It's really good to talk to you again. Shir, Palestinians in Gaza are victims of an ongoing genocide being perpetrated by Israel with broad support of the Israeli Jewish public. At the same time, there is a military war between the Israeli army and the resistance on the ground, which Israel appears to be losing. Israel's military doctrine has always been to fight short wars on the enemy's territory. This is because it was thought that Israel, as a small country, could not sustain long-term military mobilization. This has now been its longest mobilization and its longest war ever. And before we get into some of the details, although you're in Germany, give us your sense of how the Israeli public is faring right now. What are the main bases of support for this genocide and this war? And is the Israeli public able to cope with the effects of the war, both in terms of military casualties, as well as other psychological and social impacts?
Well, you've gotten right into the heart of it. I don't think I can just answer all of this in one go, but let's try to break it down and attack it from different directions. I think that what we're seeing is, first of all, that this Israeli military doctrine is flown out the window. There's no doctrine right now. What we have is a collapse of Israeli society. It is a social collapse. It's also a psychological collapse. It has to do with the fact that Israelis have lost connection with reality. Even media that used to be more or less reliable, Haaretz newspaper has always been a Zionist venue, but it was sort of a liberal venue which insisted on showing different opinions. But they have been publishing fake news for the last 9 months. Absolutely. So Israelis, for example, think that South Africa didn't accuse Israel of genocide. Because in order to know this very simple fact that anyone can find out in 1 minute, you need to read English. and Israelis, even those who do read English, they prefer not to. So I think you've started with talking about the military side of things. Obviously, Israel has a much stronger military, a lot of weapons, a lot of international support for its armed forces. But all that doesn't matter if it's the side which is fighting with its eyes closed. So that's the point, that they're killing indiscriminately. But more than this is not really a war which is driven by strategy with clear goals. This is a pure, unadulterated act of vengeance. And one thing that Israelis know, every Israeli knows, is that revenge has no chance of succeeding. And that is something, in the context of genocide, I cannot stress this enough. Because Israelis, Jewish Israelis whose families came from Europe mostly, they certainly know a thing or two about genocide. And those stories run in the families, in my family. So, of course, regardless of what Jews think about Germans, about Nazis, they also know that if they had attempted to exact vengeance against Germans for the Holocaust, then there would have never been a state of Israel. There would never been, the Zionist movement would never have succeeded to achieve what it did achieve. So now Israelis are talking about Zionism in the past tense. This is something that has become mainstream in Israel. Even right-wing Israelis that support the genocide, but they don't support the genocide because they think it will achieve something. They support the genocide because they think the story is over, and now there's no point of planning for the future.
Do you think that applies to people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are going to conferences to talk about settlements in Gaza? They think it's over?
No, it does not apply to them. They represent 15% of the Jewish population of Israel, which is the national Orthodox religious movement, which is highly messianic. They still believe in their heart of hearts that God will somehow save them at some point. So for them, it doesn't matter that Israel is losing the war, because this is only God testing them, and there will be some kind of change. And they're saying things like, we don't need weapons from the United States. We don't care if Biden stops the weapons, because we will win by the grace of God. But these 15%, I mean, it's less than 15%. The 15% are the national Orthodox Jews, but not all national Orthodox Jews are as fanatic and messianic as Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And in fact, there are also among this group of people those who say, well, there is a limit to irrational belief in divine intervention, and there is still maybe some tiny hope of saving the state of Israel by taking some kind of rational action, but those voices are ignored. But the other 85% of Jews in Israel who listen to Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and they listen to what they're saying, they say, well, if this is what the government is saying, remember, I don't know if all of our viewers and listeners are aware that Ben-Gvir is the Israeli Minister of National Security and Bezalel Smotrich is the Minister of Finance. So they are in very key positions in the government. And without them, the government does not have a majority. So they have a lot of power. And if these people are in power, and if they are willing to sacrifice everything and just wait for divine intervention, we better pack our bags. We better get out of here. And that's what we're actually seeing.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? The phrase Zionism is being talked about in the past tense really jumped out at me. Can you talk about what it looks like now, like as the political ideology? What do you mean by Zionism in the past tense?
Well, I hope we're also going to talk more about economic things today, not so much just the ideological stuff, although that's interesting too, but maybe not the best contribution that I can make to this conversation. But I do think that there is a generational thing, because Zionism means different things to different people, and especially when we're talking about the generation of my parents, let's say the generation that remembers the war of 1973, which started on October 6th, 1973, 50 years in one day before the October 7 attack, which was a trauma for the Israeli society. And it created a crisis. About 3,000 Israelis were killed in that war. This is something that has shaped Israeli society very deeply. And their understanding of what Zionism means is that if you believe in a future, and if you think about plans of how to recover from a crisis, then it is possible to salvage the settler colony and to salvage the apartheid system and to rebuild it even from a deep crisis. Now we are seeing the same people of that generation, which are saying, without a strategy and without a plan, there is not going to be any rebuilding of the settler colony. Then it's over. But they're not the generation which is calling the shots anymore. So most of these people are pensioners. And by the way, these are also the people that we see in demonstrations. So when Western media likes to say, look at the vibrant democratic forces in Israel which are opposing Netanyahu and going to demonstrations, these are people in their mid-70s. The younger generation, this is a third generation of settler colonists, which have been raised to believe that they have all these privileges because they were destined to have them, and they don't have to fight for them anymore. And this is just something that they're entitled to. And that mindset is completely incompatible with a crisis. Netanyahu has always capitulated on that kind of, on this generational thinking by saying, why should we make sacrifices? Why should we pay high taxes or tighten the belt in times of crisis? We should just take whatever we can. We should just get whatever we want. And this also means that now the soldiers are acting without any discipline. Soldiers are just running amok. But also that nobody believes that the government has any plan, and that certainly contributes to the sense of despair.
Shir, we're going to shift now to the economic front, which is your expertise, but your insights are so fascinating. So I want to just put one more thing to you. It seems to me that when you talk about that spirit of sacrifice, for Palestinians, of course, every Israeli leader from the beginning of Zionism is a war criminal by the virtue of the acts they've committed. So whether you take a Ben Gurion or a Yitzhak Rabin or Shimon Peres, these were the founding generation of Israel, the prime ministers. Even if we say these were war criminals and committed ethnic cleansing, had genocidal intent towards the Palestinians, you can say, even take a monster like Ariel Sharon, who perpetrated the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the Sabra and Shatila massacres. Do you think it's true to say that that generation were committed to something bigger than themselves in a way that the current generation are not? They had a spirit that created this state. Is that a distinction that's worth making? And is it significant in terms of the future of this entity?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not just Palestinians that consider these people to be war criminals. They are war criminals. This is a fact. They have committed war crimes. But I do agree with you that there is a difference between the Ben Gurions, Sharons, Rabins, Pereses of the past and the Ben Gvirs and Smotriches or Gallant of the present, because those of the past, they perpetrated the Nakba, ethnic cleansing. They hoped that this would be a sustainable ethnic cleansing. I'm sure you know the famous quote by Ben Gurion about the old will die and the young will forget, which is not realistic, but it was a plan, at least it was a hope for him and for his generation, and also for the generation of Rabin, who orchestrated the whole Oslo agreements as a way to create a sustainable, ongoing occupation and apartheid system with the facade of a Jewish majority in part of the country, while the other part is indirectly controlled rather than directly controlled. This was a complex strategy, a multi-layered strategy. That is the difference, because they understood there need to be some compromises. And therefore, they also shied away from committing genocide. And you're saying genocidal intent, of course. There's a famous quote by Yitzhak Rabin where he said that he wished the Gaza Strip would sink into the sea. So his dreams were genocidal dreams. But he had the military power to kill thousands or tens of thousands of Palestinians if he wanted to. But he also understood that any country that commits genocide, or any state that commits genocide, collapses. There, in fact, in recent history, I'm not talking now about the genocides of North America or or Australia, but in modern times, starting from the middle of the 20th century with the Nazi regime, every regime that committed genocide came to an end very, very shortly afterwards. So there is no Hutu regime in Rwanda anymore. The Milosevic regime in Serbia has come to an end. And this is something that Israelis know, of course. So they thought about what kind of war crimes they can get away with in a sustainable way. And once a red line has been crossed, there's no going back from it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what that collapse looks like right now. You are, a researcher in the political economy of Israel. As someone who reads Hebrew language business sections of the newspaper, what metric are you using to assess the viability of Israel's internal economic structure? Paint us a picture of what the state looks like right now.
Right. I think when we're shifting gear right now in the conversation, maybe it's worthwhile to acknowledge that this conversation about the collapse of the Israeli economy, when we're talking about an economic structure which is an exploitative and unequal structure of apartheid, when this is falling apart, this is a good thing, of course, and we're celebrating that. But it's very difficult to celebrate in time of genocide.
Yeah.
So let me just take you a little bit back to when we started to talk about this, because it didn't start in October. It started in January 23, about a year and a half ago, with the new Israeli government coming into power, this far-right messianic government without a plan. And already at that moment, a lot of Israelis realized that the economic collapse is imminent and unavoidable, with a government that is not willing to make any compromises, strategies, plans for the futures, Ben Gvir and Smotrich hoping for divine intervention. So at that moment, the BDS movement came up with the slogan, from startup nation to shutdown nation. And we started to list facts, numbers, to show what's happening to the Israeli debt, what's happening to the international investment in the Israeli high-tech sector and in other sectors as well, what is happening to young educated Israelis who are leaving the country. There's the famous picture of Israelis lining up through a very, very long street. It was a line of almost a kilometer long, lining up to the Ministry of the Interior because they were trying to get their passports so they can leave the country. That's a picture that is from March. Of 23, right? So before the war. There were already senior Israeli economists predicting a serious collapse. Some Israeli trust funds and high-tech startups, those kind of companies, were already making plans of leaving. The judicial overhaul that was already promoted by the government was basically making Israel incompatible with the global capitalist market. If you don't have strong courts that you can trust to speak up against the government, then you can never sue the government in whatever country you work in when it treats you unfairly. So we all know that the Israeli government thinks that they can force international corporations to invest in the illegal settlements, for example, and to open branches in illegal settlements, things like that. So when an international corporation like Carrefour, for example, thought, let's open some branches in Israel because the government is going to give us heavy subsidies, but we don't want to open in the West Bank settlements because then it would give us some legal problems. But the Israeli government says, well, we're going to make them. So you have to count on the courts on the Israeli courts to defend you. A judicial overhaul means you cannot count on the courts because they're handpicked by the government, and they're going to be the same settlers who are sitting in the government who are going to be the judges in the case. So don't make an investment in a country that doesn't follow the capitalist rules that the rest of the world is following. So that was already the case. That was already the investors of Carrefour were regretting deeply their mistake in opening branches in Israel, and started to suffer from widespread boycott in Europe for their miscalculation, and they were not smart enough to leave right away. So that's something that was already happening. And then something amazing happened, which I did not believe my eyes when I saw the demonstrators in Tel Aviv against the Israeli government, against judicial overhaul, saying basically the same thing about the judicial overhaul as an economic damage to Israel, of trying to preserve the apartheid system. And they held up a sign that was so big you had to take photos of it with a drone from above because it was too big to see on the ground. And the sign said, "From startup nation to shutdown nation." They just took the slogan from BDS and printed it on their sign and walked down the streets of Tel Aviv with it. That was a very interesting moment, I think, because it showed that Israeli society is starting to, maybe not intentionally, but on some level, see that this is an unsustainable situation. So now I think when we're talking about, you mentioned that the Israeli media, the Hebrew press that I'm reading every day, and I can't even read everything. I have many friends who also speak Hebrew and are sending me these articles because they're also trying to draw hope from the collapse of the Israeli economy. They believe, as I do, that once the economy doesn't function anymore, the army cannot function anymore, and the genocide will have to stop. So,
well, Shir, talk about that. I mean,
yeah.
I'm going to ask you about it from two perspectives. The perspective of an ordinary Israeli, whatever an ordinary Israeli is, living in Tel Aviv, let's say, which, I mean, let's face it, the vast majority of the Israeli Jewish population is concentrated in and around Tel Aviv. So in Tel Aviv or one of the suburbs. I want to ask you, what would they perceive in their day-to-day life in terms of economic collapse? And on the other side of this, I want to ask you for some of those big headlines in terms of, for example, when we were preparing for this discussion, you told us about the large amount of investment shifting abroad, those kinds of big indicators. Give us a sense of what this looks like on that very micro level and on a macro level.
Right. I think the micro level is more important. The macro level, there are these amazing headlines, like the one that I mentioned to you before, which is that 500 billion shekels, new Israeli shekels, in local investments of Israelis, so people saving for their pension, they shifted them from investing domestically to investing abroad. So now the majority of Israeli investment funds and the majority of the funds that they have are invested abroad. So Israelis don't believe in their own economy. So this is a big headline. And there are so many of them. And if I just go over the numbers and talk about the credit rating reduction and talk about the collapse, about more than 90% in foreign investment in Israel's high-tech sector, and the vast amount of companies that are going bankrupt, these numbers are impressive, but still they're not the big story. Because the big story in the end is what people believe. Their economic crisis is something that happens to a lot of countries. We've seen Greece in 2007 going through a serious economic crisis. We've seen Argentina in 2000. These kinds of crises, which are really very difficult and affect people very deeply. But the difference is that in Greece or in Argentina, nobody said, okay, well, this country or this state will not exist anymore. We should think about a different state now, or the economy is going to just be over. Well, maybe there's going to be a new currency, maybe there's going to be a new policy, maybe there's going to be a tough period of time and then some recovery. But when we're talking about what individuals are thinking, if they don't believe in a future, if they see this as the end, then the capitalist logic is such that there is no future. People do not invest if they think there is no future. Instead, they take out their money and leave. And this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you asked me about ordinary Israelis, let's put it this way. And this was information that was actually difficult for me to get, because some of my friends were so affected by the events that it seemed like they lost their sanity. And I was also questioning my own sanity at some point. Like, if they really believe that this is what's happening, and they think that the children that are being murdered in Gaza are somehow to blame for their own deaths, and they're able to somehow explain this to themselves, then how can I even speak to these people anymore? And I am very privileged that in my family members, or at least the close family members that I'm in contact with, think like I do. So that they're no indication of what ordinary Israelis think. But I can say that after my partner, her family is, let's say, more mainstream in their thinking. And she was arrested in Berlin because she was carrying a sign that said, "Another Jew for a free Palestine." Germany is not a very hospitable place for protests for Palestine these days. But the picture of her holding the sign became viral, and her parents saw it. And that caused a really difficult time in the family. And it took months until I was even able to speak to them and ask them these questions that you're now asking me. How is this affecting them? How do they think? And I was really shocked by their answers. Not because they were not like Ben Gvir and Smotrich. They were not gung-ho about the genocide. They were, on some level, even acknowledging the genocide. They said, the whole world hates us, and maybe we deserve it. This was a statement that I did not expect to hear from Zionists, where they say we deserve it, and so they're also not thinking about a viable future. And I asked them, how is this affecting them in their daily lives? So, of course, everything is very expensive. Prices are out of control. And this is also simply because the economy is not functioning. There's a lot of hidden unemployment, because there are a lot of people who lost their jobs, but they're not registering to receive unemployment benefits because they're in the military. They're doing reserve duty. So they said, it's impossible to get a doctor's appointment. You have to wait for months, more than twice as long for just whatever doctor's appointment you may need. And I asked them, is this because all the doctors are in the military doing reserve duty? And they said, well, this was in the beginning, in the first months. A lot of doctors were recruited for reserve duty. Now that's not the case. Now they just left the country. So they see it around them. In May, there's always the Israeli Independence Day that coincides with Nakba Day. The Israelis usually display nationalism in the most disgusting way possible that you can imagine, and cover the whole country with the Israeli flags to show their dominance, assert their dominance of the land that they conquered and the people that they conquered. This year they didn't put up any flags, or almost no flags. So they don't feel victorious. They don't feel like this is something that can be recovered from. And so I think more interesting than the fact that you have these numbers, collapse in investment and people taking out their money and leaving the country in droves. More interesting is the editorial in Haaretz newspaper on Israeli Independence Day, which said, will Israel even get to celebrate any more Independence Days in the future? And this is very interesting because the Hebrew version of the editorial was different than the English version. In the English version, they took it back a notch and they said, will Israel celebrate any more Independence Days only if we get rid of Netanyahu, as if that matters. Yeah, but to try to give some hope to their English readers, but in Hebrew they didn't qualify it. They just said, and they quoted Netanyahu himself. This is a quote from 2017. When I heard Netanyahu say this in 2017, he said it was Hanukkah celebrations in 2017 in the winter, where Hanukkah is all about this mythological story about the Hasmonai kingdom. And Netanyahu said, the Hasmonai kingdom was a Jewish state in a way, which lasted 80 years. And we should last more than 80 years. But when I saw this, and everyone who saw this knows that Netanyahu never tells the truth. He never says what he believes. If he thinks Israel will last more than 80 years, he wouldn't say that. So if he says it will, it means he thinks 80 years is the maximum. So now it's 76.
So let me again. These insights are so fascinating, and there's just a couple of things listening to the question it raises. Now, one, you talked at a certain point about even before October 7th, but in the context of the protests against the judicial reform and so on, that there was already a loss of confidence, both international and internal. Internationally, we saw a lot of so-called friends of Israel worrying about its liberal democratic status, and so that's why they were opposing the judicial reform. But internally, you talk about Israelis lining up to get passports, and of course, many Israelis are entitled to second passports because they came from other countries, although a large number aren't, or it's not practical because they came from countries where they maybe can't go back or wouldn't want to go back. But certainly there's a large number with, roots in Europe, in North America and so on, where they either already have second passports or they can apply for them. You can see that, in many countries around the world, people might like to have a second passport as an insurance policy, let's say. That doesn't mean you're going to take it. It doesn't mean you're going to actually leave the country. But perhaps there comes a point, a tipping point, where people do actually start leaving. So my question is, and you gave the example of the doctors. In a sense, that's anecdotal. I mean, that doesn't mean it's not true. But how can we get a sense of the bigger picture? Because when I looked the last time the last time I checked was maybe a few weeks ago. I couldn't, every year Israel publishes population statistics. It publishes numbers for what it calls Aliyah, which is the arrival of new Jewish colonists from around the world. I believe they publish, or maybe they don't, but people can read it into the statistics, the number of Israeli Jews who leave the country and don't return. And as I say, the last time I checked, the numbers I found were from July of 2023, so prior to October 7th. What are the indicators or the evidence that you've been able to see about whether this sort of loss of confidence is actually turning into some kind of exodus? And if so, among what sectors of the Israeli population?
Let me quickly just start by mentioning what you said about the internal criticism and the foreign criticism or worry about the Israeli economy. In fact, there is unfortunately a kind of conspiracy of silence between the big financial newspapers in the world, which are anyway very right-wing, almost by nature, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, which simply refuse to report about the collapse of the Israeli economy and the high-tech sector when it happened before October 7. And in doing that, they actually reneged on their duty to their own readers who buy these newspapers because they're thinking about how to invest wisely, and they would have not known what a dangerous investment it is. And not that I care very much about billionaires who make bad investments and lose their money, that's fine. But of course, it's not just billionaires, it's also the pension funds of ordinary people, which bad investments is affecting them. But just a side comment there. Getting back to your point about the exodus, the Israelis leaving, there has always been a problem because to measure the statistics. If Israelis are I'm in Germany right now. Germany reported a peak number of Israelis asking to start the process of a naturalization of getting a German passport in Germany in the past year, compared to like by a factor of 10 more than in any other year. But that doesn't mean that they would be registered by the Israeli statistics as having left. Because if somebody just goes out through the airport, that doesn't mean that they're coming back. You can, of course, try to measure how many people are leaving and coming in at any given moment to see what's the movement of people. And there was actually an article that was published in November, so after October 7, by Haaretz, in the tourism sector of the newspaper, so not a very political part of the newspaper, where they were just saying, by the way, we did a calculation of how many people have exited through the airport, how many have come in, and the net loss is 250,000 people. And the net loss is 250,000 people. So while the headlines were saying Jews from all over the world are gathering in Israel to fight against the common enemy and to support the Jewish state, those numbers were completely bogus, and the actual facts were exactly the opposite. But once this article was published, and of course, people who noticed it started quoting from it, they stopped publishing this information. They kept it quiet, and they're still keeping it quiet. And I've heard a talk by John Mersheimer recently, Professor John Mersheimer from the US, who said that by now the number is 500,000 Israelis who left, so double. But I'm not able to confirm that. It's not easy to get good estimates. Of course, if you go to Cyprus, for example, Cyprus is very close to Israel, so it's quite cheap and practical for whole families to move there. There is a town where you hear more Hebrew than Greek, because so many people have moved there. And I actually met some Israelis in Athens and in other places in Europe, who initially went to Cyprus, and they felt not safe in this community of escaping Israelis, because those escaping Israelis who escaped mainly for economic reasons and for fear were not willing to criticize the genocide, and were threatening the more, let's say, moral and human Israelis that were also coming with them. So they sought to further go away from those communities and seek safety somewhere. So this is something that is certainly felt outside of Israel, but in Israel, they don't want to talk about it.
And I didn't check. They just had their so-called Independence Day in May. And I don't remember seeing, traditionally, every year just before Independence Day, the Israeli National Statistics Organization publishes sort of a press release on the population statistics. Did they not publish?
Central Bureau of Statistics, they published the number of citizens and they published the number of residents.
Yeah.
If you see a gap between these two, that's a bad sign, because after 5 years, citizens lose their residency. Israeli citizens who live abroad lose their residency, but only after 5 years. So if we're talking about people who left in the last couple of months or in the last year, they wouldn't have lost their residency. They would be.
When you say lost their residency, that doesn't mean they lose their right to live in Israel. It means they lose their status in the statistics as a resident. They would then be counted as something else.
It has some significance in terms of their social benefits, national insurance,
I see.
that sort of thing. Yeah, but they have their citizenship, so they can return at any time.
I see. I understand. Just to be clear about that. And then I know Nora. Why don't you go ahead, Nora? I have many questions for you, Shir, but we also have some topics that we want to go through. So,
yeah, I wanted to ask about the civilian infrastructure and what that looks like right now, with, tens of thousands of reservists being pulled from the labor force, We're talking school teachers and engineers and plumbers and, being put into tanks, as well as the revocation of work permits of Palestinians from the occupied West Bank to work across the Green Line. What does the kind of day-to-day infrastructure and political economy look like right now? What are the key flashpoints you're looking at in terms of trying to understand this collapsing economy?
Right. Well, the loss of these soldiers to the workforce is not. I mean, it is significant. It is significant, but I think the way that it's discussed in Israeli discourse, it's not so much the loss of the workforce, but more about families trying to deal with the fact that one of the family members, usually the man, is absent for so long that they don't see their children anymore. And the government has also made it ordered that the soldiers will not have contact with their families back home. This is very unusual, especially for such a long war. I mean, my dad, who fought in the War of 73, told me that, of course, every evening they would line up by the payphone, a landline, so they can call their parents and tell them they're still alive. But the soldiers are ordered not to have contact with civilians. And at first I thought this is because they don't want sensitive military information to leak outside of Gaza, or, for example, evidence of the genocide to leak outside of Gaza. But later it turned out that what they really don't want is the soldiers to hear what's happening back home, because when they do, they lose the will to fight and they lose the sense of purpose. And that causes trauma, PTSD, and things like that. But this is not the bigger story here. You're talking about the infrastructure. Israeli economists keep mentioning the fact that Israel became smaller, in the sense that so many people have left their homes. Some of the homes were destroyed. Some are just not safe, either in the area around the Gaza Strip or in the north, close to Lebanon. So the number of people who have evacuated from these areas is more than double the number of soldiers that were recruited for the military. So that's the bigger number there. And that means people who have moved away from the jobs as well. They don't have a place to stay. So the government is housing them in hotels, because the tourism industry is anyway completely dead. And so the hotels are just standing there. So now the hotels are full of families that certainly the hotels were not designed as long-term residence areas. This is a big strain on people. Another reason that families are just planning how to leave if they can, if they have an extra passport, or if they can find a job somewhere or studies or whatever, they would just leave. So this is a very heavy strain on the infrastructure. Israel has been planning to renovate its power grid, because it has a very outdated and very polluting and inefficient power grid based on burning coal. And so they had a plan about how to upgrade all of the power plants to run on natural gas, because Israel is mining natural gas now from the Mediterranean, including siphoning natural gas that belongs to Gaza. This is supposed to be cleaner and more efficient and so on. But in order to upgrade the power plants, they need cement and steel and other materials that they are supposed to import from Turkey. Turkey is saying these materials are dual-use items. And in times of genocide, we cannot allow these items to be exported to Israel. So the whole plan of upgrading the Israeli power grid has been put on hold. And yesterday, Colombia, actually, I'm not sure if we're going to if you're going to broadcast this as we speak. So I'll say the date on June 6th. Colombia has announced that it will stop selling coal to Israel. And Colombia is the biggest exporter of coal to Israel. So You're talking about infrastructure. If there's not going to be electricity, that threatens to take Israel back to the Stone Age, basically.
I remember reading that during the apartheid period in South Africa. South Africa was one of the biggest exporters of coal to Israel. I assume that today South Africa would not be willing to replace the coal from Colombia.
Actually, South Africa is still exporting coal to Israel, even now, even as we speak, not as much as Colombia. And there is a movement in South Africa as well, which is calling on the South African government to stop the coal exports for exactly the same reason.
That's something that we need to follow up on.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that. But Shir, talk also, of course, the raw materials are vital, and Turkey announced a broad ban on exports to Israel quite belatedly, I have to say, and only after a lot of criticism that it had been not taken sufficient action in the face of this genocide, or at least not action commensurate with the rhetoric of its leaders. I mean, Turkey regularly refers to Netanyahu as the new Hitler. Well, why are you trading with Hitler then? I mean, it doesn't make sense. But certainly now they have ramped up in a way that is very significant, to the point where we saw Israel Katz, the foreign minister of Israel, launching just an extreme public tirade against Turkey that I think was a real indicator of how significant it was. But on the other side, so raw materials, consumer goods, Turkey is a massive producer of consumer goods that you find, for example, stores in Jordan are full of Turkish consumer goods. I assume there's a similar situation in Israel, because they're high quality and they're much cheaper than their European or American or other equivalents. So that will probably contribute to inflation in Israel. Not only do you have fewer consumer goods coming in, but the ones which are coming in will now be more expensive. We also want to ask you about the impact of the Yemeni anti-genocide intervention in a moment. But before we get to that, I want to ask you about the labor situation, because talk about the role of Palestinian labor in the Israeli economy, because I think that is often underestimated by a lot of people. And what's the status of that now? Are Palestinian workers still in the Israeli economy to the same extent? And if not, what can Israel do about it?
Yeah, Nora, you asked this before, and I didn't get around to answering it. Absolutely, this is a very important point. Of course, when you say Palestinians in the Israeli economy, let's be clear: there are 48 Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, and they're of course part of this economy, and are also facing the same inflation and the consumer goods and everything. Just in addition to the violence and the racism that are out of control, and the fact that Ben Gvir replaced large sections of the police with his own militia, settler militia, which he's arming, and of course, so Palestinians don't feel safe, and this is something that, of course, also affects their ability to move freely and to work and to earn a living. But Palestinians in the West Bank, which require a permit and have to go through harrowing experiences in the checkpoints every day. Nevertheless, we have to acknowledge the fact that a lot of families depend on that income. And as difficult as it is, the fact that Israel simply stopped all of these permits is a very serious blow to a lot of families who are not able to feed themselves in the West Bank. And this is a serious crisis as well. But in terms of what the Israelis are feeling from this, so a lot of economists are saying, if you don't bring in these Palestinian workers from the West Bank, the construction sector in Israel is grounds to a halt. And Israel has a long-term crisis in housing prices that is ongoing for a very long time and has a lot of factors, of course, which are related to our topic in many ways, because of the Jewish National Fund buying the lands to save them from non-Jews and things like that increases the price of the land and the houses and so on. But let's also remember the fact that Tel Aviv, for example, the biggest city in Israel, about a third of the houses in Tel Aviv were built by Palestinians. This is a settler colony that was built by Palestinian labor. And if no houses are built now, and also there was some attempt by the government to bring in labor immigrants or labor guest workers from countries such as Malawi or India to take the place of the Palestinian workers and to build and to work in the construction sector. But who wants to go and work in a burning country where there's a war going on and racist violence raging in the street and people are lynched? This is there's this kind of colonial assumption by the Israelis that people from the global south will do anything for money and their lives are worth little to them. So why not risk themselves to work for under the minimum wage and build our houses? Well, it's not working. And so these economists are saying, okay, so the housing crisis is going to escalate even more, and the fact that hundreds of thousands of families, families, hundreds of thousands of individuals from the area around Gaza and from the northern part of Israel have lost their homes and are now living in hotels, and they need houses or apartments as well. This is a very long-term crisis. Which is going to the full brunt of this crisis will only be felt in the future. But as I said in the beginning, Israelis don't think about the future. They don't think there is a future. So they spare very little thought to the fact that stopping Palestinian workers from the West Bank has such a deep impact on their economy.
Oh. Just a couple questions left. Let's talk about the humanitarian intervention by Ansar Allah in Yemen. Enacting a blockade against ships bound for Israel, and it's left. Eilat Port has been a ghost town for months now because of it. Can you talk about the impact that the Red Sea blockade has had on the Israeli economy?
Yeah. Well, I first of all, it's not just Eilat, because the ships can also go through the Suez Canal, and much more important are the ports in Ashdod and Haifa than Eilat. So those ports are also not functioning. And we saw two of the world's biggest shipping companies, one is the Danish Maersk and the other one is the German Hapag-Lloyd, basically saying, okay, we're going to go through around all of Africa in order to keep making the rounds, not just to Israel, but to all the other ports that they are supplying, even though all they need to do is basically say, we're not going to make a stop in Israel, and then they can pass through the Red Sea unharmed. That cost billions to these two shipping companies, while the two biggest Chinese shipping companies are simply saying, we're going to skip the ports in Israel and they can just go through. So this shows how geopolitics on a global level is shifting. And Gaza is really the center of the world now, as hard as it is to believe, but this is the reality that we're seeing. Israelis don't really want to address that point and talk about it. So there's very little research done about this. I've seen some reports, for example, that they're saying some things are impossible to get anymore. Some products are just because of the Red Sea blockade. But more interestingly, I think, is the way that Israelis try to address this issue by using humor. It's very silly humor, but it's they create fake characters for Houthis who are and make comedy sketches about that as a way of dealing with this. But the whole point of these sketches is to say they don't know anything about Houthis. They don't know anything about the situation, the reasons. They cannot say that the reason that the Houthis are blockading the Red Sea has to do with the genocide, because they cannot recognize the genocide. So the whole joke, which is not very funny, turns out to be just people saying the word Houthi, which may sound funny to them, or blurting out stereotypes about Yemeni people, and that's it. So it's another example of just fighting a war with their eyes closed. And if Israelis are not addressing it and not thinking about what is the motivation, what can be done about it, then of course there's no hope for any meaningful response by the Israeli side, and that brings us again and again to the same conclusion that there is no future.
So I want to pick up on that. We just have a couple of minutes, but you started at the beginning of the conversation, you said that states, or at least in modern history, states that commit genocide or regimes that commit genocide don't survive, they collapse. What does the collapse of Israel look like? I mean, obviously, no one can read the future, but what's a scenario that you think is realistic? How will this unwind? Does it end with a bang? Does it end with a whimper? Is it a quick process? Is it a long and painful process? This is a key question for Palestinians because it's an existential question for Palestinians who live under a genocidal regime, and ending this genocidal regime is fundamental to Palestinian survival, and of course has much bigger implications globally, because it is for the sake and benefit of Israel that every international institution has been vandalized and trashed and rendered inoperative, just in order to spare Israel from being accountable for its crimes. But what in your mind are some of the realistic scenarios, or the ones you think about for how this regime comes to an end?
I'll start by saying I'm probably the wrong person to ask this question, because I think that the Jewish Israelis, I'm no longer Israeli, but that's my background, are not making any decisions. They don't choose. They've already made their choice, you can say. Now Palestinians have to make their choice, and they will decide what their future is going to be like. And they will decide what kind of an end will this apartheid regime come to. Is it going to, or settler colonial regime, is it going to be a bang or a whimper? This is a Palestinian decision. I do think that, but I'm also part of BDS, and I'm part of a lot of organizations that are working very, very hard and ceaselessly, because we still believe that we can change what scenario is going to happen. I mean, it is a matter of choice and not a matter of fate. And I think that a lot hangs on the issue of the ceasefire. This is really the key issue. The ceasefire really means the difference, because I don't know if you've seen the leaked text of the ceasefire offer that Biden calls the Israeli offer, even though it's clear that it was not an Israeli offer. But phase one says ceasefire for 42 days. Why 42 days? 42 days is 6 weeks, which is exactly the amount of time that Israel needs in order to hold an election. And Netanyahu says we can't have an election without a ceasefire. But I don't want a ceasefire. Well, he doesn't want elections. But if there will be elections in Israel, then the simple truth that everyone knows but nobody acknowledges will become very apparent, that nothing changed. There is no leadership, there is no direction, there is no majority among the Zionist factions that can form a government. An election where the Zionist factions have a structural majority because it's an apartheid system will not create a solution. It will only expose that there is no solution, and the only alternative is a democratic alternative. So a ceasefire means democracy. That's how I see it. And that's the hope. Equal rights. You wrote a book about this, Ali, so I don't need to tell you about this. But this is, I think this hinges on the ceasefire. And without a ceasefire, the other alternative, the other scenario, the one that I'm dreading, is a scenario where, because of the elections in the United States and a very likely Trump presidency, the military financing from the U.S. to Israel will simply stop. The U.S. supports Israel in the same way that it supported South Vietnam or the Karzai regime in Afghanistan. There comes a moment in which the U.S. says, "Let them fall,"
which was unthinkable before October 7th. I mean, I think this is a key point, even for someone like me or like you or like Nora, who, we're engaged in this issue. And even for me, where I can be convinced, and of course I am convinced, that Palestine will be liberated, but it can, even if you believe that's true, it can remain something of an abstraction because the reality seems so solid. And I think since October 7th, we start to see possibilities that seemed unthinkable before October 7th. So, and I think that's true for Palestinians, it's true for Israelis, it's true for the rest of the world. And so, even if when I wrote my first book, now not quite 20 years ago, but getting close to that, it still seemed an abstraction. I could believe that this scenario could happen, but I couldn't tell you if it's 20 years or 30 years or 50 years. Now one has the feeling that things are fluid enough that some kind of transformational change, whether for better or worse, could come at any moment. Things are that unstable. And, I remember, of course, we've talked over the years to many of our comrades in South Africa who will say that we never thought apartheid would end in our lifetimes. And of course, when the unraveling comes, it comes very quickly. Again, I'm with the hindsight of history, I don't think it was actually for the better that the Cold War, or let's say the Berlin Wall came down. I'm not saying the wall itself was a good thing, but I think the triumph of the so-called West was not a good thing in the way it manifested itself. But nonetheless, that change, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, I was in university at the time, many viewers won't remember it, some will, was something unthinkable just a year before it happened. November 1989, when all of these governments in Eastern Europe collapsed one after the other over a period of a few months, was absolutely unthinkable. Do you think we're in that kind of period, or can things go? When you listen to Joe Biden, he talks about returning to a kind of status quo where we talk about the two-state solution, and then there'll be a normalization deal with with Saudi Arabia, normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and then Israel will be brought into the security architecture of the region as part of an alliance against Iran. I mean,
no one is taking this seriously in Israel, of course. This is nobody thinks that there's any return to a status quo. So I do think that this is realistic in the very near future to see this very big historical change. And even though I share your criticism about the unification of Germany, the fall of the wall, but I did ask a lot of Germans. I live in Germany. I asked a lot of Germans who are old enough to remember this and to remember the life before. What do they think about it? And a very, very small minority think that it was better in East Germany, even if they are very critical of West Germany, even those who came from East Germany, and they say, well, it wasn't as bad as people say, but yes, it is a little bit better now. And I think once we get rid of the utopian thinking, and we think that like one democratic state in Palestine means all the problems will be solved. They won't all be solved, but it certainly will be better. And in the same way that it happened in South Africa, how many in South Africa want to go back to apartheid? So, which is, I think, a better example than Germany. Then, yeah.
I
am
suppose the
hopeful.
conversation we're having, and maybe it's one we need to invite you back to continue, is not so much was the past better, but really what kind of future? Because nobody in South, well, there might be a few people in South Africa who want to return to apartheid, but I think for most people who would be critical, they would say it's not that we want to go back to apartheid, but we wanted a better future. We wanted the post-apartheid future to take a different path of a better economic situation for everyone, more equitable distribution of land and resources, and so on. And that's true in terms of Europe as well. It's not that I think Europe should be divided, although I'm not so sure. I don't think Germany should be divided. I think maybe Germany needs to be kept under very strict control, given now that it's on its fourth genocide. But I think that it's nobody, at least, who would have wanted the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, to lead to this kind of Europe, where the far right, even you could call a neo-Nazi right, is ascendant, and now we face the prospect of casual talk about nuclear war with Russia, and of course, every single European government, with a few small exceptions, is very pro-Israel, very much in favor of militarism. So it's really a discussion we need to have soon, I think, about what kind of future and what lessons can we learn. And in a sense, that's a difficult discussion, but it's an optimistic one, because it means we believe there is a possibility for a different future, and we hope that the beginning of that will come very soon.
Shir Hever, we would love to have you back on again. Thank you so much for joining us. You are a political economist and researcher. Very quickly, tell us about the work that you do with the Palestinian BDS National Committee and the campaign that you're working on.
I wish I could say this very quickly, but yeah. No, I'm trying to impose a military embargo on Israel and stop the weapons. So it's just chasing all those ships that are going now around Africa and finding them and getting them searched, so the weapons will be confiscated and won't reach Israel.
It's phenomenal work. Thank you for doing that. First. But no, you're on the right path. And where can people learn more about the campaign?
We have a webpage on the military embargo at the bdsmovement.net website. And there are several military embargo campaigns that might be more relevant to different people watching us from different countries. Obviously, not everyone is living in a port on the Mediterranean where ships can be stopped and searched, but those who do, please join this campaign. And those who live, for example, in places where there are universities, who can divest from Israeli arms companies and join sit-ins in front of arms factories that are providing weapons to Israel and things like that, then this is what we need to do.
Great. And that's bdsmovement.net. Shir Hever, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shir. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.